even know if I'm going to be good yet, so it's okay. Wow, that's the first time in our lives I think I've heard Dana's name pronounced correctly. Everyone always stumbles at Reinneck. It's just not one that people do well back home. So wow, this was a first. What I'll be speaking about this morning is challenging behavior, challenged behavior. You hear it referred to both ways. I suppose it depends on who's referring to it. Is it someone whose behavior is challenged or is challenging to analyze? Basically what we're going to be talking about are some of the more difficult behaviors in terms of both the individual being able to learn more easily and also being able to move into what we would call less restrictive environments, being able to move into society very easily. I will not be able to give you sort of canned answers. I do apologize for that ahead of time. One of the things that I always say going into this is I wish on all that was holy that I could give you a book that said for all hitting do this, for all spitting do this, for all screaming do this. I can't, and anybody who wants to tell you that they can is selling something. Forgive me for being blunt about it. What we can do is we can work on the methodology for how we will figure out what the intervention ought to be, and there is a research literature to guide us as well of interventions that other people have attempted, but truly applied behavior analysis, quite in contrast to some of the misconceptions, is an extremely child-centered, is an extremely client-centered approach. By the very nature of it, it has to be. There is no such thing as a pre-prepared answer about how we're going to handle anything. Everything must be done with the individual in mind, looking at their particular circumstances, looking at their particular behavior, and designing treatment plans accordingly. I usually have the majority of my talks being sort of anecdotes, which I know again is somewhat in contrast to the stereotype of the behavior analyst showing data everywhere, and we'll do that too. But I find that these things come across and are more easily understood if we make them as real life as humanly possible. So I want to begin with one of my real life stories, which revolves around a mom that I worked with, whole family that I worked with, I should say. And this is all in the public domain, so to speak. I'm not violating confidentiality. The woman that I'm discussing is Jenica Nill, who was the consumer representative to the Behavior Analysis Certification Board for a number of years. I think she was the longest serving person on the board. She just rotated off. Jenica is the mother of a student diagnosed with autism, and he has made very good progress over the years, but I would be completely lying if I said it was a very smooth trip. There has been a great deal of difficulty over the years in terms of everything from finding an appropriate school placement through inappropriate behaviors that were very much precluding his being able to participate in the community and being able to learn in regular, typical school environments. One situation which came up over the course of a few months, however, though, is what I want to talk about right now, which was inconsolable screaming tantrums. And when I say this, they were the types of tantrums where Dustin, that's her son's name, would scream so loudly and so forcefully that he actually could make himself bleed. You would actually see blood coming out of his throat from the intensity of the tantrums. And I've been doing this work since I was 17, so you kind of pride yourself, oh, I've seen everything, whatever, nothing surprises me. One of the more powerful pieces of video footage that I think I've ever seen in my life, I had asked the Nills to videotape as much of this behavior as possible so that we can analyze and look at the behavior and see if we could figure out what might be happening beforehand or what might be happening afterward that might be maintaining the behavior, as we shall discuss. And there was one particular morning, evening, I don't know what to call it. What do you call 3:30 a.m.? Would it be morning, evening? I guess it depends on your work schedule. But it was about 3:30 in the morning. All the videos, of course, I asked them to timestamp them and date stamp them so that we could organize them and make sure that we knew what was happening when. And Dustin had woken up in the middle of the night just having one of his, again, inconsolable screaming tantrums. They involved self-injury. He would be banging his head as well, the screaming, the carrying on. And I don't remember whether it was Jenica who spoke to her husband, Drew, or whether it was Drew who spoke to her husband, his wife, Jenica, where somebody just said, what are we going to do? And it was just one of these incredibly poignant moments. What are we going to do? This is reality just kicking you in the head right here. We have a student, we have a child, our child, who is not able to communicate what's wrong, what's troubling him, why he's so upset. And again, I don't want to shortchange this. He was banging his head into the walls and screaming enough that blood was coming out of his throat. What are we going to do? You know, that was the question of the moment. And I had an interesting experience with this particular behavior treatment plan because it was a very involved, detailed one, and Jenica actually presents this herself now at conferences, talking about this treatment plan with her son. And I had the misfortune of being on a speaking bill with her. We were doing a symposium together. So Jenica got up and began to describe what was happening with her son and showing this very powerful video footage. And it's one thing when a professional such as myself steps up and talks about these things. It's quite another one. Mom, the mother of the child, gets up and discusses it, and it's just that much more real. And I sat there at the little podium looking out at the audience, and I was helping Jenica with some of her technical things, and you could see the tissues being handed around, and the handkerchiefs were coming out, and people were crying and sobbing and leaning forward in their chairs and recoiling when there would be an impact that he would hit his head. And there were audible gasps coming up from the audience, and she was calmly going through all the steps that we had gone through in terms of the functional analysis and describing them in all of the detail. And then when she showed, when we finally got the treatment plan together that appropriately managed the behavior, there was this audible gasp of relief from the audience. And she finished her talk, thunderous applause. It was the Led Zeppelin reunion tour kind of thunderous applause. And the applause finally died down, and then it was my turn to speak. And I just, for probably the first and only time in my life, I got up to the podium and I looked around and I said, I got nothing here. Anybody want to go get a sandwich or something? I got nothing. And I really felt like I did, because she had completely done the thing. You know, she had done everything that was necessary to get the point across. Dustin's treatment plan, which involved the use of augmentative communication systems so that he could describe to us what was troubling him, an electronic device that we wound up using. Also, a system of having his parents come in on particular intervals so that his behavior was not tied to his parents' appearance, but was tied to more appropriate behaviors, things that we'll talk about that were part of the treatment plan. Those would not be appropriate for another student. Those particular treatment plans would be irrelevant for a student who can express himself more easily. The augmentative would not be necessary. For a student whose behavior was not tied to the appearance or non-appearance of his parents, again, the treatment plan would be useless. So again, I just want to highlight again just how child-centered and how individually designed these treatment plans are. What we're going to need to do is to look at the individual behavior and figure out what the treatment plans are going to be based upon what we see. Now, and again, I have to apologize for those of you who have seen me speak before. I've been joking about this with people. You find yourself in my position in what you call a perpetual greatest hits tour. You know, kind of like Fabian or Bobby Rydell from the 50s or the 60s, and you're still performing little clubs, and people still expect some of the same songs and stories. So I apologize that if any of this is repetitive for some of you. We'll get into some new material after, I promise. The central question of what we're going to call a functional analysis or a functional assessment is, why is he doing that? And I have emphasized the word doing because I'm not as concerned with why someone started a particular behavior. Often it's interesting to know, and often it will give us clues, but often it can be very, very misleading. And the story that I always tell that captures this one was a young man, 16, 17 years old of him, who had been throwing up at his summer camp. Now, he had been sent to a summer camp, a sleepaway camp, for about 2-3 weeks, and unfortunately the camp was not well suited for his needs. The camp staff were not appropriately trained in people who had severe social or severe language disabilities, and they, God love them, were lovely people, but it simply wasn't appropriate for my boy, who we'll call Gary for the purposes of our presentation. And Gary was not happy there. You know, I kind of joke about this, making fun of the counselors, but it wasn't their fault. But you have to picture this, you know, a 17-year-old counselor bouncing up to this young man. Come on, Gary, let's go make a wallet. As my grandfather would say, this he knows from nothing. He's not interested in making a wallet. Come on, Gary, let's go make a birdhouse. Gary was miserable. And on the third or fourth day of summer camp, a major plot point cometh, where breakfast did not agree with Gary. And he engaged in what I learned to call on the streets of Sydney, Australia, a technicolor yawn, which is to say he threw up on everyone and everything. The counselors said, "Oh dear, Gary is sick, let us let him return to his bunk," where Gary went back to his bunk and did whatever it is that 16, 17-year-old boys do when they're all alone all day in their bunk. Whatever it was more entertaining than the activities of camp. Now, I didn't know if I would be able to get away with that one. Thank you. It's always dodgy with those kind of stories here. But the next day, breakfast was fine. Gary did not have a problem with breakfast. Everything was good. And Muffy and Kit, his counselors, came bouncing up. "Come on, Gary, let's go play dodgeball!" Which is a particularly sadistic game for people who are not attending to the environment very well. But again, I can't blame them. You know, they were hit by God with the untrained stick. They were not prepared for this. So Gary, hearing that it was time for dodgeball, was observed to go, "Blah!" And he put his finger down his throat and he made himself vomit. And again, 10 out of 10 for sincerity, but minus several hundred for training. The counselors said, "Oh dear, Gary is sick, let us let him return to his bunk." And Gary went back to his bunk and did whatever it is that 16, 17-year-old boys do when they're all alone all day. Now, the central point here, Gary started throwing up because he was legitimately sick. He was legitimately physically ill. However, from that point forward, the behavior took on a life of its own. The consequences of the behavior, i.e. being able to avoid activities he did not want to engage in, and perhaps being given access to behaviors he would prefer to engage in, were what maintained the behavior. So when I say what are the variables maintaining the behavior now, it may be different than why the behavior started in the first place. And again, this is just one of those situations. In my own work, sometimes I get to play Dr. House, which is loads of fun. I get called in after all kinds of other stuff had been going on, and this poor kid, they've been taking blood from him, they're calling the Mayo Clinic, they had House show up. You know, why is this guy vomiting everywhere? Looking at the records, it was fairly straightforward to me. It looked like that it was a behaviorally based situation where he was engaging in this avoidance or escape behavior, which was unfortunately being reinforced. So he was coming home at this point. And again, I make light of this story just because of the silliness of some of the situations, but it was very serious. By the time he was coming home, he was so weak that he really couldn't move very much. In fact, he was moving around in a wheelchair to get off campus, as I understand it. You can't sit there in the heat of our summers and throw up all your electrolytes and think that you're going to be in any kind of condition. If you want to see what Gary looked like tomorrow, I'm running the Causeway Coast Marathon as a fundraiser for Pete. You've all done it, right? Okay, we'll pass a hat later. If you want to see what Gary looked like, come and see me at the finish line tomorrow, because I'm sure that's what I'll look like. You know, I was scoping out yesterday the course, and I wish somebody would have told me there's so many hills here. I'm picturing a nice flat course, you know, it'll be lovely. No, I'm running on wet sand and a mountain. Good luck to me. I'm going to have a heart attack and die. It'll be loads of fun. But funds will be raised. But anyway, back to Gary. This poor guy was really very weak from all of the throwing up he had been doing, and he was really, unfortunately, as a teenager, a candidate for a heart attack at this point. So this was a very serious behavior to make sure that we managed. There was a basketball court across the street from his home where they played loud music. He hated it. That made it perfect for me. I wanted to have something he didn't want to do. So I went to Gary's house and I said, "Come on, Gary, let's go play some basketball." And reliably, he went, "Blah!" And I find that I turn into my father at times like this. My father had wonderful expressions for every situation. He worked in New York City's housing authority, and they called him the king of cliches because you always knew what my father was going to say. He had a line for every situation, and I've internalized that now. And I find that I've become my father, and he threw up, and I just had my father come out. That's very impressive. Can we go now? And Gary was baffled because hitherto every time he had vomited, let's let him go to his bunk. No. My only question is whether they're going to clean it up now or clean it up later, but we're going to the basketball court, mate. The behavior no longer served its function, as we would say. It no longer allowed him to avoid. We then worked on teaching him appropriate ways to say, you know what, I'd rather not do that right now, I'd rather do this, so that he had what we would call a functionally equivalent behavior, something a bit more socially appropriate that he could do. And again, don't think that this only has to be for students with the verbal skills that he had. Sorry if this is going to mess up your camera. Ted Carr, Dr. Edward Carr, and Mark Durand, to psychologists back home in the 80s, did a tremendous amount of work in something we would call functional equivalence, where what they did was they looked at inappropriate behavior, say self-injury or other injury, which is a euphemism for somebody's attacking you. They went into places that were not very well staffed, not very well run, some sheltered workshops and things like that that we had back then, and they worked on very simple responses. Our sister here, unfortunately, does not have the ability to speak very fluently, and she has been in the habit of engaging in some self-injurious behavior, which, in looking at her in a way that I'll talk about, we've determined is attention-seeking. So what Dr. Carr and Duran did is they said, what could we teach her to do instead of that self-injury, which would serve the same function? And one stood behind her and taught her to do the old sleeve tug. So you notice this is a coordinated effort. Dr. Carr stands in front, Dr. Duran comes from behind, hand over hand prompt. Dr. Duran takes the hand and teaches her to do the sleeve tug, which serves the function of, hey, you, I need your attention. Oh, okay, what do you need? Our sister here, unfortunately, did not have the ability also to communicate certain needs, so they gave her a card. They noticed that her behavior seemed to occur when she had done the same task repeatedly. Maybe she's getting bored. Maybe she wants something else to do. Maybe she just wants to be left alone for a bit. Now, she couldn't read, but she could be taught, when I hold up this card that says, I need something new, that was the green one, somebody came and brought her a new thing to do. When she held up the other card, which was yellow, that was the I need 5 minutes alone card. So notice she didn't know what was on those cards. It might as well have been Chinese lettering. But she could learn that simple response. Hold up this colored card and that happens. Hold up this color card and that happens. And now she no longer had to engage in the self-injury because she had a more socially appropriate way of getting that same need met. So that kind of functional equivalence training, as we call it. Sometimes people wrap this up with something we call functional communication training, where we teach people relatively simple communicative responses. Back home in American Sign Language, the thumb between middle finger and forefinger here is the sign letter language T, waved back and forth, or the light bulb motion, or the royal family wave here. That is, I need the toilet. This is requesting the bathroom back home. In case you're ever in the States and somebody does this, that means they need the bathroom. And actually, public safety announcement, my real name is not Newman, my real name is Chichelnitsky. That just didn't survive Ellis Island to New York. Back in Mother Russia, this is the equivalent of giving somebody the finger. So just don't ask for the bathroom this way when you're in Moscow. People will be upset with you. But again, functional equivalent responses, functional communication responses. These might be treatment plans, might be, once we determine, again, what are the variables maintaining behavior now, which is what we're going to talk about how we're going to determine. Step number 1. Sorry again for the camera here, I apologize. I should have set this up beforehand. Define the behavior in such a way that we can all agree when it's occurring, agree when it is not occurring. I am sitting. Hopefully none of you have a problem with the fact that I am sitting. However, at some point, as I begin to slouch, I am no longer sitting. I am laying, I am reclining, I am whatever your word is. What is your plane of the goal line, as we say in American football? Real football. No, just kidding. At what point am I no longer sitting? My definition has to be the same as your definition if we're doing behavior treatment plans, if we're gathering data. Because think about what would happen if I have a different definition than you do. I'll do the treatment plan when you don't, you do the treatment plan when I don't, I'll take data when you don't, you'll take data when I don't. It'll all be very confusing. So I realize this may seem like a bit of overkill, but in the beginning we have to be very clear about exactly what behavior we're dealing with in terms of defining it. Self-injurious behavior, I'd mentioned. That involves what? Does it have to be the closed fist? Can it be an open fist? Can it be biting yourself? Can it be, darn it? Can it be, oh, you know, at what point does the behavior stop being self-injury? What are we actually talking about? One of my favorite training films that I show to all of my staff and in my parent training and things like that, it's a 45-minute film, but it takes us 2 days to go through because we're stopping and starting it constantly, is something called Harry, which was treatment of self-injury in a young man. He actually wasn't autistic. He was only an as they say in the film, mildly retarded, or as we'd say now, mildly cognitively impaired or cognitively delayed, but tremendous self-injury problems related to his behavior. Something else he did, secondary behavior, was he would approach people and do something that looked a little bit like this. Unsettling, isn't it? Yes. Especially, again, you have to picture the contrast here. It's me and Steve. Harry, who is 6'5" or 6'6", you know, with a 5'5" guy like me, it can be a little intimidating, getting down on you and face-to-face snarf kind of situation. They had a treatment plan when Harry would get too close, which was they would fold their arms and turn their head to the side until he moved a sufficient distance away. And one of the things that you could notice is that Harry would test that plane of the goal line, getting closer, further away, scooching his chair and scooching back. How close can I get to this person before they do the arm turn and the head turn and the arm fold? That's one of the ways that students will rat you out, as we say back home, in terms of how well you're carrying out the treatment plan, because they will absolutely adjust their behavior based on your responses. If you're someone who gives them 6 inches, they're going to take the 6 inches. If you're someone who turns and folds at the 9 inches, then they're going to take the 9 inches eventually. You learn what everyone's plane of the goal line is. It's very important that we all have the same definition, because unfortunately we often think we know what we mean. Crying. We all know what crying is, right? Does it need tears or doesn't it? Where does crying end and weeping begin? Where do moping and sulking fit into this? We need to define crying in such a way that we can all agree, yes, it's happening, no, it's not happening. Step number 2, appropriate measurement system. How are we going to measure this? One of my favorite teachers I ever worked with, her first time that we were working together, was a tough time at the school. I was doing a program helping a young man to learn to eat who came to our school at 7 years old only drinking Pediasure. He ate no solid food whatsoever. In the course of that treatment plan, shall we say, I got messy a lot. You know, some of my staff referred to me as looking like Courtney Love, if that reference makes any sense to you. But that's basically what I looked like, you know, basically slightly warmed up death. And Susan, that was the teacher's name, she took over a classroom where there were students who were having some interesting behavioral difficulties, and we came together at the end of the day looking like slightly warmed up death. And I asked her how her day was, and she said, well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is they had only 1 tantrum. The bad news is it lasted 4 hours and 2 people are dead. Now, of course, luckily she was engaging in some hyperbole here, but thinking about this logically, if he had only 1 tantrum, frequency of 1, but it lasted for 4 hours, duration of 4 hours, maybe the frequency isn't the important dimension. If there truly was the mayhem that she was describing, maybe some magnitude measure would be important to have. Okay. I'm sorry I keep picking on you guys this week for sitting up front. Would you ask me what I got for my anniversary a few years ago?
What did you get for your anniversary a few years ago?
I got a lime green fluorescent kayak. And at 170 pounds that I am, it's a kayak which is meant for a 350-pound man. It's the big yak. I have this out on the ocean and sharks are making fun of me. What the hell are you paddling, mate? It's like you're on a pier. And because my wife believes that I'm not terribly concerned with my own personal safety, she also got me a matching lime green life jacket with a matching lime green oar. I can be seen from space. This kayak is so big that cruise ships go by, and I barely rock it. You know, you could have a tsunami, and I'm basically stable in my kayak. Okay. Now, all of this is completely accurate information. I make fun. I love my kayak. Don't get me wrong. It's a wonderful thing. But if you'll notice, I gave myself a mental count of 7 before I answered the question. The behavioral measure that we're talking about here is latency. How long does it take for the behavior to start following the cue, which was you asking me the question? My accuracy, if we were talking about percent correct, was 100%. I gave you completely accurate information and, in fact, more detail than you could have possibly wanted. But it took me a good 7 seconds to get started. Thinking about this functionally, if I was teaching a student to have an interaction with another student, latency makes the behavior useless. You can be as accurate as you want to be. If it takes you 7 seconds to answer, the other kid's already gone. What'd you get for Christmas? 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,004, 1,005, 1,006, 1,007, 1,000. I got, where are you? Whew. They don't have that patience to wait that long. So the behavior would not be functional in the sense of appropriate for using in everyday life. This is why I say we have to make sure that we pick the appropriate measurement system, because we might be very successful in teaching a particular thing, but if we don't have the appropriate dimension of behavior that we're looking at, we may not capture it. Now, whether we're talking about teaching new behavior, such as teaching someone to answer a question, what'd you get, or whether we're talking about a behavior like a tantrum or something like that, we need to pick the proper dimension that will accurately capture the behavior. The third step is to baseline, which is where the rubber really hits the road, so to speak. We're going to start observing the behavior, and we're going to start trying to get a picture for how and why the behavior is occurring. Now, the antecedent, that means what came before. The behavior itself, that's the behavior in question. The consequence, what happened after the behavior. Now, this can be done in a couple of different ways. There's simply naturalistic observation. I'm going to manipulate nothing. I'm simply going to set up a video camera, or I'm going to park myself in the corner of the room, and we're simply going to observe as the behavior unfolds, a kind of naturalistic observation. This is part of what people frequently talk about as a functional behavioral assessment. I can also be a bit more heavy-handed about it and deliberately manipulate conditions. Taking it back to Gary, my young man who had learned to vomit, I could manipulate, for example, the level of demand. Or I could manipulate whether or not he was allowed to avoid activities depending on whether or not he had regurgitated. There are things I can play with. I can make the environment more or less loud, more or less stimulating. When I am deliberately manipulating conditions to see what it does to the behavior, then we're in the realm of what we call a functional analysis. So again, this distinction isn't often made by people outside the field, but within the field, there will be this distinction between a functional assessment, we're doing the observations as they occur naturally, versus the analysis where we're specifically creating conditions and we're specifically testing what do these conditions do. However, whether we're doing the assessment or the analysis, this basic step remains the same, where we're going to assess what happened before the behavior, what did the behavior look like, what was the consequence of the behavior, and please go thou and become a video camera. No interpretations. Don't interpret yet. That's after all the observations are done, and we'll sit and we'll look at the observations, then we'll start drafting our observations. But one of the books that you saw flashed up there at the beginning, the Behavioral Detectives book, and we'll talk a bit about that this afternoon, that book basically was sort of 50 stories where things had gone dreadfully wrong. You know, you get 3 or 4 pages of that, and then you try to figure out why, and you turn to the back, and there's 3 or 4 pages of explaining why we did what we did and how we hopefully improved the situation. One of the stories was of the worst ABC analysis I've ever seen in my life, which was a young man that I was asked to see because of some very severe behavior. And there's no nice way to put this. He was asked to come to the table, and I'll always remember that his observation was close to Valentine's Day because the group was reading Froggy's First Kiss, this little book series back home, Froggy, which my son, who, don't get scared, there's a person sitting under the table there. If he comes out, and don't get frightened. My son is doing his homework under the table as we speak. But David loved those books when we were young because the mom always calls her son, Froggy! And he loved to do that. This was a good bedtime book when he was 2. And Froggy's First Kiss will always be in my mind because this particular student, he was being asked to come to the table while one of the older students was going to read Froggy's First Kiss. And my man got up from the swing where he had been sitting. In fact, that's where he spent almost all of his day. There was a wonderful treatment plan that said he could earn the swing for not engaging in behavior, but he was sitting in the swing all day anyway, which kind of undermined the effectiveness of the plan. And he got up from the table, from his swing, and he walked over to the table, and I just don't have a nicer way to put this, than he sucker punched another kid in the back of the head. Just clean, bop, sucker punch in the back of the head. And the person who was responsible for the ABC sheets dutifully called out, "Oh, we always have lunch at this table. He thought it was time for lunch. When he got here and saw that we weren't having lunch, he got annoyed and he punched Tyrone." Wrong! That's not how you do an ABC sheet. In fact, that's almost the antithetical of how you would do an ABC sheet, because I don't want to know the function yet. If you interpret, you are biasing your observations. What we want to have is as clean a description as humanly possible. And this is again why we often videotape, so that we can have what we call inter-observer agreement and have two people looking at the same behavior at the same time and try to describe what they're seeing. Because God love them, everybody comes with biases. I joke about these things all the time in terms of how we see things and how we interpret things differently. I can't stand certain things in American media, almost all of it, but it drives me insane. And some of the television programs, I just can't begin to understand what's even vaguely entertaining about this. Some of this stuff is so depressing I want to kill myself. Some of these medical dramas, you ever see I don't know if you get them here, like Grey's Anatomy and ER and Private Practice. Those are the most sadistic writers on the planet. Nobody is ever happy for a split second, and if they are, they're hit by a helicopter in the next scene. It is just misery fest. I can't begin to imagine why anyone would watch this. I can't begin to imagine why anyone owns a Bon Jovi CD. You see, but these are personal biases. He's got a box set, 100,000 Bon Jovi fans can't be wrong. Where's your box set then? I don't have one. Well, I guess I'm not as popular as him, am I? Well, apparently not. So somebody digs what he's doing. It just isn't me. And I'm going to look at this very different than somebody who's a fan of one of these shows is going to look at it. I always talk about this in terms of baseball back home, one of obviously our big sport outside of our version of football. And the New York Yankees, passions run very high, in our sports. People advocate. Dana's brother is a Yankee fan, wonderful. And my father, and thank you guys very much for those of you who were here when I brought my father over shortly before he died. Everyone was so lovely to him, and that meant an incredible amount to him. You don't know how much this meant to him. He was dying with Alzheimer's. And yet he tried desperately to hang on to all the memories of when he was here. He was actually writing in a little book, a little diary, trying to remember. He would keep writing the stories, trying to remember everything he did here. And you were all just so lovely to him. I can't thank you enough. He was a New York Jets fan, our American football. And we buried him with a Jets football, and we carved "Go Jets" into his tombstone, which ticked off the people at the cemetery, but go ahead, dig him up. I double dog dare you. Go ahead, I dare you. Dana's brother saw this and thought that would be really lovely, that maybe he would have something for the Yankees put in his tombstone. And Dana joked with him and said, no, we're going to do something for the Boston Red Sox, their arch rival. He actually didn't speak to her for 3 weeks. And he told his mother on her. That's how passionate people are about their sports rivalries and things. And the Yankees were playing the Cincinnati Reds in one of our championship games. And the Reds were murdering us. It was just, again, us. I'm a Yankee, right, because I'm from New York. The Reds were just destroying the Yankees that year. And the Yankees had a third baseman, a rather plucky man by the name of Craig Nettles, who just didn't take a lot of garbage. And the Reds had a third baseman, Pete Rose, who would come sliding in this head-first slide of his, so we should all know just how hard he's playing. And Nettles did what everybody in New York wanted to do. Rose came sliding in, and Nettles went, boom! And Nettles tried to kick his head off his shoulders. Perfectly fine that he did it. I'd get a spike in his eye for all I care. But the Yankee announcer, Phil Rizzuto, who, if you're a Meatloaf fan, he does the baseball voiceover in Paradise by the Dashboard Light. He was the Yankees' second baseman back in the 50s, and he grew up to be the announcer. He had the unmitigated gall to say something to the effect of, oh, when Rose slides into Nettles. Now, don't be ridiculous. We all saw what happened. Nettles took a 20-yard run at it and tried to kick his head off his shoulders. Perfectly fine that he did it. Let's not pretend he didn't. But I honestly believe that Rizzuto saw it that way. Yankee pinstripes running through his blood, as we say. He was just so convinced that the Yankees could never do any wrong that, of course, it had to be Rose leaving the base path and sliding directly into Nettles' foot for unknown reasons. But I honestly believe he saw it that way. And that's why I ask everybody who's taking ABC data, everyone do it. It's not just one person, because I don't want to be controlled by anyone else's particular biases. Everybody who's involved, take ABC data, and then we'll sit down and we'll try to look at all of the observations and try to make sense of them. But please, again, the key point being, make sure that you're being as objective as you possibly can. It's impossible to be completely objective, but try to avoid any kind of interpretations. Try to just keep to describing exactly what's happening. From here, we will logically do the next step of drafting a hypothesis. Okay, given what we have seen, what do we possibly think might be going on? Suppose my observations are something like we saw with Gary with the vomiting. The behavior only comes out when he's asked to engage in particular tasks that don't seem to be ones that he finds particularly appealing. That leads us to believe that it might be avoidance-based or escape-based. He's trying to get out of the activity. On the other hand, I described a situation where the young woman was engaging in some behavior when she was alone, when she did not have anybody working with her. When people were working with her, she wasn't engaging in the behavior. That might look like some kind of attention-seeking behavior. Going back to Dustin, the boy I described at the opening here with his tantrums, they occurred across a wide variety of conditions. He was eating his favorite food, he was watching his favorite video, he was sleeping, he was alone, he was across a wide variety of conditions. We saw this behavior emerging. The function, and this is what made this one so tricky, was not as clear-cut as it might be in other cases. And we wound up having to be looking, honestly, the first thing I thought of was physical. He had some rudimentary communication skills, but he couldn't tell me if he was having a headache. He couldn't tell me if he was having a toothache, if he was having hangnails or something like that. I remember Jenica, his mom, actually was touching each one of his teeth with a toothpick, trying to see if there might be some sort of tooth pain that he couldn't relate to us that might be related to these random, just out of nowhere, screaming fits. When you have this behavior which is occurring across these wide variety of conditions, you can't ever discount the possibility there might be something physical going on that the student is not able to communicate to us, unfortunately. And sometimes students can use the same behavior to serve different functions across different settings. It can be actually quite complex. But that's, again, why taking such careful observations is so important, because then we start saying, you know, sometimes even get out the old penknife. Okay, these seem to go together, these seem to go together. What does that tell us about what might be causing the behavior? But it definitely becomes a logic game at this point. And please go back to your Sherlock Holmes. Do not draft a theory too early in the case. Otherwise, you wind up twisting your facts to meet your theory rather than twisting your theory to meet your facts. Data-based discipline. We're taking data before the treatment plan is put in place. We take data while the treatment plan is put into place so that we can guide our treatment plans. Is this working or isn't it? If it isn't working, then we need to look at why it might not be working. Perhaps it's the right plan, but we're doing it wrong, or we're not doing it consistently enough, or perhaps it's the wrong plan entirely. There may be, a number of reasons why a treatment plan isn't working, but again, the first thing we have to do is look at what we have up until now, what treatment plan is logically suggested by the behavior, by the ABC sheets. Do we need to be teaching an alternate response? Are we accidentally reinforcing the behavior? What might be occurring here? We'll draft our hypothesis and we'll plan our treatment plan accordingly. And of course, our last step is we're going to test our hypothesis by carrying out our treatment plan. Hopefully it's very successful and we move along, but that is not always the case. Effective treatment plans, effective behavior management do require the two things. First, we need to pick the correct variables. We need to come up with the right treatment plan. And then we need to carry out the treatment plan properly and consistently. And I realize this is going to sound paradoxical, but doing the treatment plan properly 95 times out of 100 may be worse than never starting in the first place. Think about the rules of reinforcement. Now, a reinforcer, a consequence, very simple. A behavior that when it follows, a consequence, something when it follows a given behavior makes that behavior more likely in the future. That's the definition of a reinforcer. Any stimulus, anything that follows the occurrence of a behavior and makes that behavior more likely in the future, that's a reinforcer. We break them down into positive and negative types depending on whether it's something we've presented, positive, or whether it's something we're taking away, negative. These are not value judgments. Okay? High five. I have presented something. Is it a reinforcer? I don't know. Did her behavior probability increase? Now, what did I say? I said high five, and she reached up and I clapped her hand. What if in the future, when I say high five, she's less likely to put her hand up? I didn't actually then reinforce her behavior. Maybe I punished it. Maybe she doesn't like touching me. Maybe she doesn't like physical contact at all. Maybe I was too hard. I thought it was a reinforcer, but the data don't lie. If in the future she is less likely to raise her hand when I say high five, then I have not delivered a reinforcer, even though most people would think that I had. Praise is not necessarily reinforcing. Depends where it comes from. There are certain people that if they gave me a good review on one of my books, I would have them pulled from the shelves. I just know this person's, not someone I'd want to appeal to, so if they like it, I must have done something wrong. Now, negative reinforcement is a scenario that a lot of people have some difficulty with, so let me try to, again, put this into easily captured terms. I'm going to ask her to do a simple behavior, which is, let's just say, touch her nose, a body part ID, something that I know she's familiar with. But instead of touching her nose, when I ask her to do something, she's going to let out the blood-curdling scream that's going to scare the hell out of all of you and start having a massive wobbly on the floor here that's going to last for a half hour. Ready? No, she's not ready. Well, let's assume that we did that. Let's just pretend, okay? We'll all agree that that's what happened. And while she's on the floor, I say, oh, damn, I'm sorry, never mind, sorry, didn't mean to upset you. And I back off, and I withdraw my demand, I withdraw my request. I withdraw my presence. Now in the future, when I ask her to do something, I notice that she's much more likely to pitch herself on the floor and start carrying on. What has happened is I have accidentally negatively reinforced the behavior. Now again, negative and positive are not value judgments. They just describe what you have done. Anytime the behavior increases in probability, that's a reinforcer. Positive means something has been presented. Negative means something has been taken away. So she begins to pitch a fit. She chucks a wobbly here, and I back off. If in the future she's more likely to chuck a wobbly when I make a request, I have accidentally negatively reinforced her behavior. The way I put it in one of my books was, nature doesn't care what you meant to do. Nature only cares what actually happens. The fact that I backed off when she began to engage in this behavior, I reinforced her behavior. Whoops. That's what happens frequently. People accidentally do things not realizing that they're feeding into the behavior. Negative reinforcement very commonly occurs this way. Now, whether we're talking about positive or negative reinforcement, I can also be more or less consistent about it. Every time she engages in the behavior, I can deliver the consequence, or not every time. Sometimes it's systematic, like every third or fifth time, or sometimes it's just random, every once in a while. We would call that intermittent reinforcement. So if I do the consequence, if I deliver the consequence every time she engages in the behavior, that's continuous. If it's not every time, it's intermittent. And again, intermittent can be more or less specific in terms of its intermittency. This has broad importance for behavior. Now, I am well behind my soda consumption for the day. By now, I should be on my 4th Diet Coke. I'm very far behind that. We're doing a scientific experiment. You may actually observe me explode. We're not actually sure what will happen because I haven't gone this long without a Diet Coke in years, so it'll be interesting to see what actually occurs. If one of my limbs falls off, that's why. Now, soda machines are my friend. I like them. They're fun. They're continuous reinforcement machines. You put your money in, and your soda comes out. Very nice. It's a continuous reinforcement system. Every time I put in adequate money, I press the button, and my desired soda comes out. But the world is not yet a perfect place, is it? Barry Manilow. The world is not yet a perfect place. Barry is still here. Now I'm sure some of you are Manilow fans. Again, remember, reinforcers as individual as people are, right? Everyone's bringing their own perspective. People find different things reinforcing. Maybe you don't like Diet Coke, you bizarre person. The continuous reinforcement is put on extinction, as we say. it is, and I don't know why I accompany it with sign language, but the reinforcement stops. The machine does not give you the soda. What do? Yeah, kick it, punch it, jump ugly with the machine. You get medieval on the machine. That's a phenomenon we call an extinction burst. To no longer reinforce a behavior is extinction. That's all that word means. Extinction is the behavior is not being reinforced. Bet both of your legs that any time you institute an extinction procedure, you're going to see an extinction burst, which is to say, temporarily, the behavior is going to get worse before it gets better. And it usually gets worse in one or all of three very predictable ways. The behavior bursts in frequency, the person does it more. Magnitude, the person does it with some greater degree of intensity. And variability, the person does the behavior in different ways. It can be quite dodgy when it comes to inappropriate behavior. I always talk about this, leaving aside any kind of autism spectrum disorder or anything. I always joke about this with the supermarkets. Now, my father, some of you got to meet, was a wonderful man, brilliant man, best father there ever was. He would take me to professional wrestling on a school night because he figured out, what difference does it make if I'm a little sleepy in school the next morning? We had a damn good night. We had a fun memory. He would take me out for ice cream at 5:30 in the afternoon, partially because my mother's cooking was always a disaster, and partially just for the fun of it. So we would do that sometimes. Other fathers know it'll ruin your appetite. Appetite comes back. That's a rule. My mother invited me to dinner a while back. She said, want to come over? I said, oh, no, remember I had that Snickers bar in 1973. It ruined my appetite. Haven't eaten since. She didn't think I was funny. Now, the supermarket is just wonderful as you watch the child sounding very much like James Earl Jones. Father, I desire a Three Musketeers ball. And Dad, because he's not my dad, says something stupid and dad-like. No, it'll ruin your dinner. Is the game over? Of course the game is not over. The game has just begun. Candy requesting behavior has been placed on extinction. Now we'll have the extinction burst. Frequency. I want candy, I want candy, I want candy. Magnitude. I want candy, I want candy. Variability. Down on the ground, kicking over the displays, Cartman on acid, just trashing the place. At which point Dad gets embarrassed and says something like, oh, here already. As I always say, one of those phrases that never means any good. Oh, here already. Any conversation that includes, oh, here already, you've lost. There are certain conversations that we've all noticed over the course of years. Have you ever heard someone say no offense and not been offended? I don't mean to hurt you is always followed by a but. Get ready, here it comes. And oh, here already fits into that category. What oh, here already actually means is you have now tantrum sufficiently to my satisfaction that I am mortified, and I'm going to give in to your tantrum and reinforce the behavior. That's what oh, here already actually means if you look it up in the dictionary. Not a good idea if you're reinforcing intermittently, if it's a behavior you want to get rid of. If you don't believe me, go to the Las Vegas airport, which I have to connect through in my work in British Columbia sometimes. If you have ever been to the Las Vegas airport, it is a nightmare and a half. You have people who have consumed way too much alcohol, staggering around, gambling in the actual airport itself. Now, the casinos want you to come, right? They want you to come there and spend your money there, so their slot machines are going to pay off every once in a while. Do you think the airport cares whether you're coming back? Of course not. They know you're coming back. Your plane is there. You have to come back. The slot machines in the Las Vegas airport are the tightest slot machines on the planet. They virtually never pay off anything. And yet, there's always somebody who's drunk way too much Jack Daniels sitting in front of the machine. They never even get to their hotel. They start playing in the airport, and they're broke before they leave the airport. That's how insidious intermittent reinforcement is. Slot machines pay off every once in a while. When's the next time? It could be the very next one. And won't you feel stupid if you just dumped $400 into a machine and Bernice comes along and puts in a quarter and wins $1 billion? Yeah, that'll happen. But that's the nature of intermittent reinforcement. You never know when it's going to pay off, so it leads to this very high level of responding that has a great deal of, as we say, resistance to extinction. Remember the soda machine, you expect it to pay off every time. As soon as it stops paying off, you have that quick extinction burst and then you're done. How would you even know if a slot machine was broken? You really wouldn't, would you? That's the nature of intermittent reinforcement. So when we say doing behavior treatment plans properly and consistently, we have to be very careful. Because if we're not being consistent, if we're giving into the tantrum, let's say, sometimes, even if it's a comparatively very few, that can be enough to keep that behavior going. So I sometimes advise people, or I should say always advise people, if you're not prepared to carry through on the treatment plan the whole way, this may not be the time to start. If there may be some reason, I do a lot of toilet training programs, which is ironic because my wife actually toilet trained my son. I was in Canada at the time. Toilet trained, I don't know how many thousands of people in my life, but I wasn't involved in my own family. Hey, cool. Got out of that one. Until everyone is ready to eliminate the nappies and the pull-ups and really do the concerted effort involved in toilet training, it might not be a good idea, particularly for students diagnosed on the autism spectrum, where they tend to have a habit of falling into certain obsessive-compulsive behaviors. Easily, 3/4 of the toilet training I'm called into these days, and it's not actually toilet training. It's something like an obsessive-compulsive trait. The student will hold it in for 48 hours until someone puts a nappy on him. That's not toilet training. That's dealing with an obsessive-compulsive behavior. But because sometimes people have not been very consistent in carrying out the treatment plans, these kinds of behavioral situations get created. So again, very important to be consistent once we decide what the treatment plan is going to be. Otherwise, we really can't get a good assessment of whether it's working or not. So again, just very important. And forgive me if this sounds a bit ominous, but inconsistency can be worse than doing nothing. Now forgive me here, I just wanted to check our schedule and what we're going with. Okay. I would like to start, even if I'm not going to finish, an application of this. And I don't know why I just bothered doing that, because I have no idea how to work this. Just looked impressive, but I have no idea what I'm doing. Can we bring up the sleeping presentation? I'd like to take an area that affects many of our students and look at some of the possible scenarios which have come up in terms of over the last number of years, where I've seen where some of the difficulties have been, and again just highlights the individualized nature of how we have to approach the problems. Now, many students diagnosed on the autism spectrum will have sleeping disturbances of various sorts. Many students seem to function on much less sleep than everybody else. They're awake at 3 in the morning and it's showtime! I apologize if this sounds, I'm not making light of it. Believe me, I also work in residences, so I've got adults that I'm doing this with. And some of the adults still have sleeping disturbances and are more than happy to start screaming at 3 in the morning, which works out really well in the apartment buildings where we're renting flats. I had an ongoing relationship with the landlord of one of the buildings. I don't know if you've ever had this experience where somebody says something to you and then it just sticks, you can't follow the conversation anymore because you're so troubled by what he just said. And we were talking about one of my adults who was having sleeping disturbances, and forgive me for the camera and for everybody here, this is just the way it happened. He called me a smooth-talking son of a bitch. And what bothered me was I knew I had heard that before, and I couldn't think of where. So then he instantly became one of the adults in the Charlie Brown cartoons. He kept yelling at me, wah, 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 and I kept thinking, where have I heard that before? And then I finally realized it was from The Godfather. It was the movie producer, and that's what he yelled at Robert Duvall, what he called Robert Duvall. And once I figured that out, I was able to get back to the conversation. But I honestly have no memory between him calling me that and when I figured out it was Robert Duvall and the movie producer. What happened in between? Not a clue. But I just, he's yelling at me on the phone. What am I going to do? He was not happy with me. Sleeping disturbances affect everybody. So I'd just like to run through a few of the common scenarios and what was responsible for the sleeping disturbances for these particular students. Now, of course, sleep is just a bizarre concept, and my son is fighting sleep. He refuses to ever go to bed if he can possibly help it. He is fighting a lifelong battle against bed. He just doesn't see the point. And from an evolutionary standpoint, you could see where my son is coming from. Sleep doesn't make a lot of sense if you're thinking about evolutionary survival, making the body vulnerable, so to speak, for a third of the time. Probably not the best idea if you're living out in the savannah somewhere. It must serve some pretty serious function. And in fact, it does. Sleep does provide a period of physical growth. I apparently missed it. And the recharging of neurochemicals. People will start to hallucinate. People will start having difficulties if they're not sleeping appropriately. And that's because of this biochemical process that takes place during sleep. Now, how is it that the body does sleep? The body has a circadian rhythm. It governs sleep patterns. The circadian rhythm is tied to these various factors: sunlight, which releases natural melatonin, other kinds of sedatives, diet, exercise. A lot of things feed into the actual sleep cycle. All these things we have to think about when we're dealing with students who are having sleep disturbances. Now, there are a number of them in the DSM-4, which is our version of the ICD, the American Psychiatric Association. There are particular specific sleeping disorders, and then there's just what we see with the autism spectrum disorders in terms of either not going to sleep until the middle of the night or very early morning awakening, or falling asleep. I've seen students who fall asleep on the bus and have a 40-minute nap, and that seems to serve the same function as 8 hours of sleep for the rest of us until they eventually crash. It can be quite unusual from our usual standpoint. There can be a variety of behavioral and biological components that we see here, different things that can affect the sleep cycle physically. Now, looking at the autism spectrum disorder, these are the most common: bed refusal, early morning, late night awakening, decreased need, as I was saying. Obviously, as we've been talking about, you have to figure out exactly why the why the behavior is occurring to draft the treatment plan. Now, our first scenario here, and this is one that I find very common, is that people have kind of drifted from where we ought be. And I realize this is going to sound paradoxical, but when I have a student who's having a sleep disturbance, one of the first things I tell the parents is, don't be too quick to put him to bed. Because if he's not really ready to go to sleep, putting him in his room or putting him to bed, you can do that. And I can have a treatment plan that says you're going to stay in your room, and I have a treatment plan that says you're going to stay in your bed, but I can't physically force him to sleep. I want the bed to become a conditioned stimulus for sleeping. Now, remember your Pavlov. He had his little doggy there, right? And he ticked a metronome. People think it was Pavlov's bell, but whatever. In the actual Russian, he's ticking a metronome, one of those little ticky devices that people use to time step workouts. The metronome would tick, and Pavlov would produce the food powder, right? And the doggy would start to salivate. And that's actually not the way it worked originally. Pavlov was actually studying digestion. He actually has a Nobel Prize in spit, as I always tell my students. He actually had he was a physiologist and was studying digestive juices. But what wound up happening was Pavlov wanted to study the effects of putting the food powder in the dog's mouth, but as soon as the dog would see Pavlov, it would go, oh boy, here's the food, oh boy, and spit is shooting everywhere. The dogs had associated Pavlov with the food. So Pavlov brightly said, Boris, talked to one of his research assistants, come here, you will now feed the dogs. And in short order, as soon as Boris showed up, the dogs would say, oh boy, oh, damn it, Piotr, come here. Pretty soon, as soon as Peter shows up, Dmitri, you come here. Everybody became associated with feeding the dog, and before they ever had the meat powder in the dog's mouth, the dog is shooting saliva everywhere. Not very helpful in terms of studying the effects of the food on the saliva. To Pavlov's great credit, instead of giving up, he said, all right, let's study this associative process. How is it that this neutral thing, Dmitri, became paired with food to the point where the dog actually responds as though the person was the same thing as the food? Now, this is a very simple animal model from back in the old days. Classical conditioning like this, though, is a very effective phenomenon. It does happen a great deal in our lives. Now, thinking about, you walk into a toilet, you walk into the bathroom, even if you don't have to go, when you walked in there, the fact that you walk in there, suddenly you start to feel this. And speaking as somebody who does as much toilet training as I do, this is an occupational hazard. You think you're all set, and then you walk in there with the student, and you're like, oh, hell, would somebody have him for a minute? I need to go, Whoops. Classical conditioning, it's not something you think about, it's just something that automatically happens. Things become associated with other things. I want that bed to be associated with sleep. If this student is not ready to fall asleep until 11 o'clock, putting him in bed at 8:30 actually undermines his sleeping program. Because he is not associating that bed with sleep. He's associating that bed with playtime. I'm not going to be sleepy for another 2.5 hours at least. I'm going to bounce around in this bed and I'm going to just mayhem will occur for the next 2.5 hours. If I think this is the type of phenomenon I'm dealing with, I ask I ask the parent to keep the child awake until he's ready to collapse. When he's ready to collapse, then you put him in bed. Because I want that bed to be associated with sleep, not associated with play. Now, as he continues to do this, we will be waking him up at a normal time, and we will be moving that bedtime earlier and earlier, but I'm going to move that bedtime earlier and earlier as he is ready to fall asleep. Because I want that bed to be associated with sleep. I don't want the bed to be associated with play. Just a simple classical conditioning thing where we're making sure that we're not making bad associations. If I put the student to bed too early, bad association. We don't go to bed until we are actually ready to go to sleep, making sure that the bed remains a conditioned stimulus for sleep. Okay, Eileen could make her mommy appear by leaving bed. Right? Eileen gets up, walks over to mommy. Mommy would take her back to bed and lay with her until she fell asleep. This is a very common scenario as well. Okay, if this is the case, is the behavior-consequence relationship that you want that you're going to be doing this forever? Probably not. Okay, if leaving the bed makes mommy appear, I'm logically going to leave bed if I want to have mommy come. But what if the behavioral contingencies were reversed? There's a treatment plan in the world called a differential reinforcement of other. It's one of my favorite treatment plans. Basically what it amounts to is reinforcing if the target behavior does not occur. Now, I almost always have my prop with me. I actually have my Garmin watch on because I was going to bring only one watch, so this is for running the marathon tomorrow. But ordinarily, what I've got here is a basic $10 Casio watch. As I always joke about it, you can always tell the action nerd, or behavior geek as I like to call us. We've got the Casio watches. A nice rubber thing that isn't going to hurt anybody. It counts up, it counts down, it beeps on intervals, it takes data, it does all kinds of wonderful things. You see a nice cheapo Casio watch, you know you got a behavior geek. I will set my Casio watch, let's say, for an interval, 1 minute. A student in the classroom who's calling out or leaving his seat or some other behavior we've targeted for reduction. I will set an interval. Jim, do not get out of your seat or do not call out for the next minute, and if my timer rings for the 1 minute that you haven't done it, we will earn a point towards X. We'll have some kind of reinforcement system in place. For some students, it's not even a point system, it's a more immediate reinforcer. But the key is, if the student doesn't engage in the behavior, I will reinforce. If they do engage in the behavior, oh, I'm sorry, you just called out, I need to reset my timer, and I'll start over again. Please do that. People sometimes make that mistake and don't reset the timer with a DRO. Kiss of death, man. Let's assume I've worked you up to a 5-minute interval in a DRO, and at the 1 minute mark, the evil urge overcomes you, and you engage in the inappropriate behavior. Suppose I don't reset the timer. What's your incentive to keep it together for the next 4 minutes? There really isn't any. So as soon as the inappropriate behavior occurs, whatever you've targeted for reduction, whoop, sorry, need to reset the timer. Basic DRO treatment plan. There's a lot of variations on it, but a rather simple, straightforward, just reinforce if the behavior is not occurring. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to flip the consequences. Before, Eileen would get out of bed and mommy would appear. What I'm going to do now is mommy is going to appear if you don't get out of bed. I'm going to set my timer, and if Eileen stays in bed for the interval, mommy comes and makes a visit. How you doing? You okay? You asleep? Everything good? You need anything? Got all your stuffed animals? Got your whatever? All right. I'll be back in a bit. And mommy goes out and resets the timer again. As long as Eileen stays in bed, mommy will reappear on the interval. And the interval at which mommy will appear is lengthened gradually, as we see with the student's behavior, that they are able to traverse the interval without engaging in the behavior. We gradually lengthen it. And this can, again, it starts off very, very simply. I have students that honestly were on 30-second plans at one point who now earn a pro wrestling pay-per-view from me once a month. We've extended the interval so dramatically that they're actually earning things on a monthly basis. I mean, most people would give it up by that point, but I just like to keep reinforcement in place, and it's also fun for me because I like reinforcers. I just do. And they're fun for me, and it gives me an excuse. I like to watch kids' TV. And it's fun for me to tape things for other people because then I get to watch it. Get Jimmy Neutron here? Is that cartoon, Jimmy Neutron? That is a good cartoon. They have a lot of like grown-up adult things plugged in there if you actually know the language. Jimmy's parents are into some kinky stuff if you know some of the language there. It's actually quite shocking if you know the vocabulary that Jimmy Neutron's parents are involved with. But all kinds of fun things like that. I'd like it. What the heck? You know, life should be like that. We should get paid for doing the good stuff. People shouldn't come down on us for doing the bad stuff. You know, it would be much more fun, wouldn't it, if like the cop pulled you over and gave you a bonus for driving well? Wouldn't that be great? Here's a 5-pound note. You were staying on the speed limit, as opposed to penalizing you if you go above. I think the world would be much better that way if we worked on reinforcing behavior as opposed to something else. So I like to keep my reinforcement systems in place. At the school that I direct, we have what we call a reward store. There's a roving cart and a room of all kinds of fun stuff. And on the half hour, students who've been following all the rules earn a counterfeit dollar that they can then trade in from the rolling cart, which comes around the school all day with all kinds of goodies and stuff on it. Or there's big ticket items that they can buy at the reward store. But that whole idea of people should just behave appropriately because they should, yeah. And I shouldn't drink every drop of bourbon that Kentucky produces, and I shouldn't smoke every cigar that Honduras produces. I'm giving it an effort. I'm no quitter. I'm going to try. And it's not possible, but I'll keep at it. I'm going to drink every drop of bourbon they can produce. I'll go with them, sure. Obviously being facetious here, but the game is very straightforward. We, as adults, have no problem thinking that we should receive a paycheck for the work we do, and yet students should just do what they should do because they should. Yeah, that'll work out real well. I like to provide incentives for people to keep it together, good reinforcement systems. It's just the way the world works. So let's think about how we can reinforce the behavior that we're looking to see as opposed to having some inappropriate consequence if an inappropriate behavior occurs. Now I need to throw it back out to you guys. I can do another 5 or 10 minutes to go through a few more scenarios in sleeping, or we can take your coffee and tea break at this point and come back and do a few more. How do people feel? Assertiveness is reinforced. There was a dramatic pause, and then somebody said, coffee. All right. Now my feelings are really hurt. Okay, why don't we take our break here? We'll come back after the scheduled break, and I'll do a few more sleepy things. Yeah, I'm just going to do another 5. And can you just turn off your mobiles again? I have very few rules in my classrooms back home when I teach, but one of the rules that I announced on the first night is any mobile that goes off, I answer. And trust me, you do not want me answering your mobile. I will ask whoever's calling what they're wearing. You don't want... Don't make a run at it, as we say back home. So if you, I know you've already switched off your mobiles, but if you can switch them off again, just to be sure. Let me just take a couple of extra minutes here to run through a few more scenarios. Then we'll have Dana come up and speak intelligently, as opposed to myself. The next thing that I would just want to look at in terms of a sleeping issue might be if diet was involved. Scott had a late-night ritual. He would have several drinks, many of which took the form of something of the order of Red Bull, which we have back home, which is basically, you know, electricity and caffeine in a can, and, you know, how wired can we make somebody? Obviously, if you're going to be drinking a great deal in the evening, we're going to have issues with, if it is caffeinated, which is a stimulant and a diuretic, and even if it didn't have the caffeine, you would certainly be having the issues of having to go to the toilet during the evening. Obviously, we want to be careful with cutting caffeine and other stimulants too close to bedtime. There are other conditions also medically that have to be looked at. There is something which is called restless leg syndrome, for example, which some students can have, which is affected by certain dietary issues, particularly if there's not enough magnesium in the diet. Also, this sometimes gets a little tricky because some students do take a lot of vitamins, and some of these vitamins can have synergistic relationships in the system. So, for example, somebody's taking a great many of the B vitamins. There's a synergistic relationship between magnesium and the B vitamins, and you taking an extra B vitamins, and these extra B vitamins, as they're excreted in the urine, will sometimes take some of the magnesium with it. You can have perfectly appropriate magnesium intake and yet have a magnesium deficiency, because it's being leached out of the system with the extra B vitamins, things like that can occur, as it's been explained to me by some of the doctors that we work with. And again, restless leg syndrome being just one example. But there can be some dietary issues for many students that will affect the sleep cycle, and we do have to look at those variables as well. Again, though, I just want to emphasize this is what we're talking about here are the experimental elements of things. We would have to vary the diet. With each of these interventions that I'm mentioning, we're talking about having ascertained what we think is the important variable based upon our observations, and then systematically varying things to see what the effect actually then is on the behavior, in this case the sleeping. The next student, we have Jordan, who had experienced some nightmares and was afraid of being alone in bed because of the nightmares. When we're going to do anti-anxiety treatments, you do wind up having to decide, because there are different anti-anxiety treatments. Taking this into the realm of phobias, for example, there's something called a systematic desensitization, where I will slowly and gradually introduce you to that which you're afraid of. To do a classic systematic desensitization procedure, what one does is first one teaches some sort of coping response, a relaxation response, something to help the person to physically calm themselves. One then creates a hierarchy of things that are troubling, from least anxiety provoking through most. So, for example, some of the students that I've worked with, some of the adults I've worked with, who've had some phobias, let's say just taking dogs as an example. Just seeing the written word dog on a page can be unsettling for some people. There are things that can, when you're dealing with a true phobia, that can be just absolutely frightening to the person involved. One woman I'm thinking of who actually left her toddler on the beach. She was afraid of birds and a seagull appeared. I mean, what are the odds of a seagull appearing on the beach? But she ran to the boardwalk in a blind panic and turned around a quarter of a mile later to realize that her 2-year-old was still on the shoreline. But that's how frightening some of these stimuli can be when somebody has a true phobia. Even the word dog on a page can be upsetting. So we would have to create a hierarchy. Let's assume that we're dealing with dogs, just to make it a nice concrete example. The least anxiety-provoking stimulus might be the written word dog. Above that might be a picture of a cartoon dog, let's say Snoopy or Odie from the old Garfield comic strip, if you got that one. Some sort of simple, innocuous, very benign drawing of a canine. Then we might move into a picture of a dog. We might start with something like a Chihuahua, which is quite frankly not a real dog, but you know, all bug-eyed yapping things. Some little dog, and then work our way into real dogs from there. And we might start with pictures and then move our way into video and then actually interacting with actual real live canines. Something that I do just want to point out if you're doing systematic desensitization work, fear is a good thing. To be completely fearless is not the goal here. I see some clinicians, and quite frankly I just want to kick them in the head as they say things like, oh, and I've got him ready to interact with rabid Rottweilers with no problem. You should be afraid of a rabid Rottweiler. There's a reason for it. Completely fearless is stupidity. We're just looking to get people to a level where they can tolerate the type of anxiety-provoking stimuli that they should be able to tolerate. But you know, we're not looking to have anybody start wrestling with crocodiles. And by the way, public safety announcement, something I learned in Florida when I was working there. You do not have to outrun the alligator. You only have to outrun the slowest person in your group. So just keep that in mind if you ever find yourself in that kind of scenario. Now, in this kind of situation, there's also flooding as a treatment for anxiety. So let's say that you have someone who's afraid of snakes. You just kick him into a bathtub full, like in the Indiana Jones movies. Someone's afraid of water, you just push him over the side of the boat. I strongly do not recommend this. There have been times in my life with typically developing adults where I have done this type of treatment, but it was something that I was completely backed into a corner. Somebody who shows up at my office on Monday and says, I'm taking a new job in California on Wednesday and I'm afraid to get on planes. Could you have waited a little longer, mate? In that case, we had absolutely no choice but to skip the systematic desensitization, which can be somewhat time-consuming, and just start taking what we would call puddle jumpers back home, little short flights between, say, New York and Syracuse, a 45-minute flight back and forth, just getting him used to being on airplanes. And I'm sorry if you're anxious, but there's just no time to do the fancy systematic desensitization thing, so whatever you're afraid of, we're going to chuck it at you in abundance. As we used to say in graduate school, as long as your client doesn't have a heart attack, it's usually successful. I really don't recommend flooding as a procedure for anxiety if you can possibly help it. The systematic desensitization, much more humane and probably much more effective when you get right down to it. But it is more time consuming, because what we're going to have to do is teach those coping skills, teach the relaxation skills, construct the hierarchy, and then begin moving the person through that hierarchy systematically. Introduce him to, say, the written word dog. When he can tolerate that without anxiety, we move to the next level. Let's say the cartoon drawing of the dog. If he can't handle the cartoon drawing of the dog, we then have to back down a step. The idea with systematic desensitization is to move people through what they're afraid of without them feeling much anxiety at all, preferably none. That may not be possible, but trying to minimize the level of anxiety that someone experiences as we gradually expose them to that which they're afraid of. Our next student was awake until the small hours. She could not sleep, and again, you can't do ABA from 8 miles away. I hung out in the house to see what the situation might be, and discovered that there was absolutely no mystery about why she could not sleep. The house was incredibly overstimulating. There were blasting TVs, there was blasting music, there was blasting video games, there was all kinds of stuff going on, and it's really a nice, unfair double standard. We as grown-ups can go to bed whenever we like, right? But we send somebody else to bed, and they're missing all the fun stuff, right? All this cool stuff is going on in the house, and not only can't she sleep because it's too noisy, but she was thinking about all the things that she was missing. So I'm not saying that your house has to turn into a morgue or anything of that sort, but you don't want it to be so overstimulating that it's difficult for the person to sleep, or that they feel that they're missing out on all kinds of fun stuff. This student, Mark, engaged in a great deal of ritualistic behavior, and it got to the point, I kid you not, everybody in the house would pretend to go to sleep. It was one of the oddest things that one could see, but everyone would get into their jammies, everyone would get into their thing, would go lay in bed as quietly as humanly possible. It was like some episode of The Twilight Zone, and then somebody would sneak out and look through a periscope and try to find out if Mark was sleeping, and then if Mark was sleeping, everybody else could get up again. But it actually got to that point where he would not go to bed unless everybody else did, and they slipped into this ritual of doing this. And I guess it's okay, but do you really want to go through life like that? I mean, I'm picturing having a dinner party for the adults who would come over, and telling your guests, oh, by the way, please bring something to pretend to sleep in, because Mark will not go to bed unless everybody else goes to bed, so we're going to set you up on the couch with a pillow and some blankies, and you'll pretend to go to sleep, and then when we know he's asleep, everyone can get up again. I suppose you could do that. God bless you. That's dedication. But nothing that I would really strongly recommend if you can possibly help it. We do have different forms of treatment that are meant for rituals. Response blocking is pretty much of a fancy way of talking about flooding, where the person simply is not allowed to engage in the behavior that they have been engaging in. And we can do systematic desensitization kinds of things, getting the person gradually used to that which is troubling them. In this case, people being awake while he's going to bed. The one thing I would put on this, and this is the last thing I just want to talk about before I hand it over to Dana, these things have a tendency to grow, which can be very troubling when it gets to these kind of behaviors, and one has to be very careful about what kind of deals one makes with the devil when it comes to these kind of behaviors, because they start in a particular place and can grow quite significantly. A student who, as he walks through the door, has to tap it once. It will not be very long before you're standing there with the student tapping the door 300 times and ready to kick your head off your shoulders if you try to prevent him from doing so. I have what I hope is a very lovely tattoo on this left deltoid. It covers up a really nasty bite scar. We had a student, rather large gentleman, who was very good at basketball, and he had to sink 20 free throws. And one day God said, let there be an object lesson. And at the 13th free throw, the fire alarm went off. So all 5'5" of me is now walking over to all 6'5" of him. Fire alarm, let's leave the building. Yeah, that wasn't happening. So, you move through your prompting hierarchy. Verbal prompt, time to leave. Gestural prompt. That's not working. Went through every prompt in the book, and finally nothing to do but a physical prompt, which is to say take him in the appropriate escort that the state has approved for that year and physically escort him out of the building. And he just leaned down like a giraffe and clamped on. Just one of those great moments in life, you're watching the blood run down your arm going, yeah, that's going to leave a mark. And Dana's called that one my Raiders of the Lost Ark scar. You can make perfect braces for his teeth by looking at my arm before I covered it up with the tattoo. It was a rather dreadful experience. But nobody ever thought about it. Well, he has to sink 20 free throws, so what? So he sinks 20 free throws, what's the big deal? Things happen. That's going to prevent him from sinking 20 free throws, and then somebody like moron here winds up suffering for it. We have to be very careful with this. I've seen students who would walk and insisted on carrying one stuffed animal with them or two stuffed animals, and you come back a year later and they got 50 of them. And heaven help you if you try to take one of those 50 stuffed animals that they insist on cuddling with them at all times, and they know where each one is. And they know what each one is supposed to be, in what order, where, and you muck about with it, and God help you. These kinds of things can take on a life of their own and become very, very significant. So please just be real careful when you think about what kind of accommodations you're going to make, because you will find yourself pretending to go to sleep and insisting that everybody in the house pretend to go to sleep if you're not careful in terms of allowing these things to get created. When we do our sort of role play scenario things that we'll do this afternoon after lunch, we'll pick up a few more of these and we'll practice them and we'll see how we set them up. But what I want to do at this point is just transition over and have Dana talk to you a bit about some of the sensory-seeking behavior. So I will see you again after lunch personally.